Hey there, I'm Gilad Barash, and welcome to Who's Your Data, the podcast that deals with how data influences life and how life influences data, the human side of data analytics. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Who's Your Data podcast, episode 19. In this episode, I talked to Ryan Janssen and BLankley, the founders of Zenlytic, a company that strives to bring the world generative AI-powered self-serve business intelligence. But what does that even mean? How does it work? And most importantly, will it make the analyst role obsolete in the future? Join us as we discuss the problem that Zenlytic aims to solve, how LLMs understand your business data, how they'll affect the role of the data analyst in the organization, and where data products are today in the innovation cycle. Let's get to the interview. Ryan and Paul, welcome to the Who's Your Data podcast. How's it going?
It is good. Thanks for having us on. Excited to chat today.
Yeah, super excited to be here. Thanks so much for hosting.
Sure thing. So can we just start off, can you talk a little bit about your backgrounds and what Zenlytic does and where you saw the need for the solution?
Totally. Yeah, I can kick things off there. I'm Paul. I'm one of the co-founders of Zenlytic with Ryan, and I'm a nerd's nerd. I was math and computer science undergrad, math and computer science grad. Ryan and I actually met when we were in grad school at Harvard, both doing technical degrees together. So we worked on everything from tracking asteroids to doing all other sorts of cool AI projects in grad school. Right after that, we started data consulting. So that's setting up a lot of analytical systems for companies from startups to Fortune 500s. That's setting up all of the stuff you think about when you think of modern data stack. That's, Fivetran, pulling data, data warehouses, configuring BI tools. And with our background in AI, which when we were in grad school is when the first Transformer paper was published, we saw just this huge and growing gap between the capabilities of, what I would call legacy BI tools and what became and was becoming at that time possible with large language models and NLP. And that's kind of when we started Zenlytic, and we decided, hey, there's actually a really big opportunity in one of the biggest software markets on the planet, business intelligence, to, create a next generation product that makes self-serve actually possible. So our kind of tagline is, we're the world's first self-serve BI tool.
Yeah, in my background, I zigzag back and forth between engineering and venture capital, basically. Engineer first in my native Canada, moved to the UK, became a VC there for a long time, got really excited about building businesses. So I crossed back across the table, did that master's degree, which is, where Paul and I met. And then we sort of started working together from there. And yeah, the funniest thing that I took away from that whole experience, having lived on both sides of that table, is funny because, I lived as an Excel monkey for a long, long time. And then I went back. I remember the first line of Python I wrote was the first day of our master's degree, actually. And I couldn't believe how powerful the tools had become, and like Python and R and some of these dedicated languages for analytics. If you know what you're doing and how to use these tools, you can really navigate things quickly and easily. What Paul and I ended up doing while we were doing consulting work, but that just completely widened the gap from the people who don't know SQL or Python, don't have access to those tools. And I've always been kind of shocked that was the case. Self-serve is kind of a four-letter word in analyst circles. There's been a debate whether or not it's even been possible for a long, long time. I think that's rightfully so, because I think it only just became possible probably in January of 2023, this year. And that is because this new technology, LLMs, have unlocked some new ways for us to consume data. And, the world before this, self-serve meant static dashboards, right? And it's like, okay, you can look at a dashboard. If you want to go much deeper than that, generally it results in a chat with a data analyst, right? So like once you go beyond basic filtering and you want to start pivoting or drilling or exploring more deeply, in most cases, that's pretty hard to do without advanced knowledge of SQL or Python, SQL and or Python, and a good understanding of how relational data works, right? That's kind of where we came in, and we said, all right, well, we wanted to build a better self-serve experience. We integrated that technology quickly into our existing self-serve BI platform in the form of a always-on data analyst. So this chatbot can talk to you and answer your data questions. It takes a couple seconds instead of a quick data pull and opening a Jira ticket to the data team. And, our goal is not to replace the dashboard. It's our, Zenlytic is a great platform with a good dashboarding experience. That's not what we're trying to replace. I think people often have that misconception. What we're trying to replace is the conversation with the analyst that inevitably happens after you look at the dashboard.
That's a really good point. And I have to say, in the industry, certainly self-serve BI tool is sort of a holy grail that has never to date really been reached, that the further away you are from the data and not having the context and not understanding, like you said, relational database, the harder it is to ask meaningful questions. And then, of course, inevitably, you're going to have to talk to an analyst and get somebody to translate that into the actual data tools to be able to pull that and help you shape that meaningful question. So I can see how now utilizing an LLM could kind of bridge that gap. So Zenlytic is a chatbot basically that uses a large language model, just like ChatGPT, that you can ask questions about the business, about the data. And so 2 questions for you. Can you explain what that means? And first of all, what is the difference to you between data analytics and business intelligence in your mind?
So I'll just kind of talk through like how it works, and I think that'll also explain maybe a little bit of differences between like business intelligence and data analytics. I would say maybe that I would kind of posit that business intelligence is the goal. Like that's why you're doing this in the first place. Doing the actual analytics of slicing these things, filtering these things, going, into the tool and doing that work is kind of the analytics. But it's like what you really want at the end of the day are insights that are going to change your behavior. Something that's going to make you invest more in a certain area, run a campaign to these people. Like you want data to result in actioning items that change the way you do business. And if it's not going to do that, then you probably shouldn't be investing in data. So I would say that's maybe a little bit of the difference there. I would say one way that we enable that is that we're not just taking in a question and just generating some SQL and surfacing that insight back to the user. The reason for that is that SQL can be really, really complicated, and metric definitions are very complicated. And you really need someone who has, knowledge of SQL, knowledge of relational databases, has in-depth knowledge of the business to be able to say, hey, this is how we should count active users. This is how we should define revenue. These are really important, really complicated concepts in pretty much all businesses. And this is stuff that you need an expert to define. But once you have the expert go in and define that, just asking for different slices of it and asking for different views of it and asking for different filters and things, that's not stuff you need a human to answer. That's stuff that once that hard work has been done of defining it correctly, you can use a large language model to surface and make those insights available to the end business users.
And going back to your original question of like data analytics versus BI, I would say by a way of analogy, I think of like maybe like a film projector or something like that. And if data analytics is the film, and maybe data is the film and it's a big mess, data analytics is kind of looking at little bits of film. I think of BI as the lens, right? Data analytics is a broad thing that could mean it covers a lot of different fields, right? From all the way from the theoretical to the practical. I think business intelligence is taking all of that, all the information and the power you have at your disposal there, and giving it a focus and an impact, as Paul says. And it's kind of like a big problem with our industry in general. I feel like data folks tend to start with what the tech can do and then focus on the problems it can solve instead of the other way around, right? So it's a very tech-first approach instead of a human-first approach. And that's part of the reason why it feels like there's a gap between the data analysts and the end users, because the end users, they don't care about data at all. They just care about how it solves their problems. They don't care how fast the database is or how many billions of rows you can process or, whatever, how cleanly it's modeled. They just want to know the fastest, easiest, lowest friction way to get the information they need to do their jobs better, right? And I think business intelligence is the lens that focuses that.
A lot of times when I'm working with the business side and I try to get requirements, I always try to ask, especially with, department heads or somebody who's head of the business, I'm like, what is your pie in the sky? What would you ideally like to see? More than likely, it's not possible because of the tech, but then maybe there are proxies, maybe there's some way around it that we could get some sort of close approximation. But having, such revolutionary technology come along certainly helps you get closer to that goal of giving them the pie in the sky.
One of my favorite questions too is like, it's almost like it's funny because in the community, I think it's a bit of like a trope now, but I think in practice, it has a ton of value. It isn't asked as often as it should be, which is like, how would your actions change if the data said this and the data said like, okay, I can get that for you. What would be different if this was the outcome, or this is the outcome, and thinking critically about how that data is being used is super valuable.
That's an excellent question. You know what my favorite question to ask is? when they come with a question about that they want something from the data, my question is why? Why do you want to know? Because sometimes they're asking the wrong question, but we'll get to that. And they don't realize that because, again, they are removed from the data and they don't know what's possible.
100%. And that's actually one of the reasons why we're so excited about LLM technology is exactly that, right? And there's been language applied to BI tools for a long time, including us. Before the revolution happened, we had a single query box, right? You could type in something, it would translate it into a structured question. But those data pulls often involve that sort of refinement, and people don't know exactly what they don't know what they want exactly, and you have to clarify, what is your focus? What metrics are you looking at? Do you mean gross or net here? By switching to a chat-based paradigm, you can actually change that into a discussion and have the AI agents sort of refine that question and make sure the person's asking something that will deliver value in the end.
One of the issues with ChatGPT in general is that language model was built once on data that I think leads up to 2021. So it doesn't include training data that's younger than that. So anything after 2021 is not necessarily included in it. So it is missing important context of kind of recent life. For example, it has no notion of Kylie Minogue's Padam Padam, which is the song of the summer in 2023. But how do your domain-specific LLMs differ from that?
So I think the important thing about LLMs in the way that we use them is that they're a reasoning engine, and it doesn't actually matter what time of data they're trained on. And let me explain why. Because what we're doing basically is that we're using the LLMs to basically translate from a user asked this question. Based on that question, it doesn't matter, data around current events or anything, and just pick from the list of these companies' metrics. So you're basically giving the large language model the context of the business, either go and pull the things that we'll then need to create the SQL query or ask a follow-up question. And the ability to look at all that context and ask a follow-up question if it's not clear what's meant from that question, or go and pull the information and go and send it back to the user. That is actually just sort of a general reasoning ability. It's not actually dependent on when. So if it had a cutoff at 2022 or if it had a cutoff in 2020, it actually wouldn't make a difference for us. Now you're right. If you said, filter down the data for just the date that this song was released on, that it would fail at. Luckily, we haven't seen too many people asking about that. So so far, it's not an issue.
Well, there's a really important second piece of tech here too, right? Which is the semantic layer. And like LLMs are one necessary condition, but not sufficient condition for self-serve. Semantic layer is a necessary but not sufficient, but together they can deliver a self-serve experience. And the semantic layer, we can dig into other stuff it does, but one really important thing it provides is context, right? Context on the organization. I guess maybe it helps to define semantic layer. That's kind of the tool that translates business type metrics into a query on a relational database. That's cool. That those have been used ever since business objects. But the neat thing is that is the clearest map of how an organization thinks and acts, right? It like you encode all of your important metrics and KPIs and dimensions. Those are all captured in that single document, basically in a structured way, and that gives the LLMs tremendous context to understand the business. Now that solves two problems, actually. It solves the pre-2021 problem. That semantic layer is kept up to date, and that provides up-to-date information on the business. It actually also solves the bigger problem that I think people ask about LLMs is are they training the LLM on my business's data problem, the privacy? And that's a big question, right? And I think that there's other approaches that are getting LLMs to write SQL and have intimate knowledge of a company's data warehouse and things like that do suffer from that. Our approach with the semantic layer actually corrects that, because when you use a semantic layer, actually no company data has to go to the LLM, right? You only send some of the metadata that's inside that semantic layer. The LLM sees that you have a metric named gross sales, but it doesn't get to see what your gross sales are.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the ways in which you'll see analysts' job changing as large language models become more and more prevalent inside of organizations, is that you will actually, as an analyst, spend more time defining these definitions that then large language models use to surface to the end users, as opposed to you trying to keep up with all the requests. Instead, you're kind of building the machine that lets all the requests be answered in seconds, instantly, from could be thousands of people, as opposed to just trying to get back to emails as fast as you can and just ever dreading more headcount being added and more questions coming in. So
I
it
like
decouples the amount of time the analyst spends from the amount of questions being asked of the data. And that's really important.
I like to think of it as the sushi shop analogy, actually, where data analysts that are doing quick data pulls, it's almost like you're like a waiter or a waitress at a sushi restaurant. And people ask, they want, a salmon onigiri, and you got to bring it out, and you're bringing out the tuna rolls to people. Going forward, as we have more automation opportunities unlocked through these tools, your job's going to go from bringing people sushi to actually building one of those cool conveyor belts like they have in like Japanese sushi shops. And you're the person that's actually, just builds the conveyor belt. And this thing just gets shipped out and people can self-serve and take the sushi as they need.
Okay, but two questions about that. One, as I'm thinking about it, it seems to me that even when you define certain metrics, they may be nuanced and different from, let's say, department to department or from pull to pull in terms of like how you sample the data and what, positives and negatives exactly mean. So that is still for the end user. Actually, it wasn't for the end user. That was really the analyst stepping in and understanding. Is the end user going to need to understand this, or is the LLM going to help with that?
So the LLM can certainly help with it. And let me give an example, maybe. This might not be exactly what you were thinking of, but say someone comes in and says, how have subscriptions changed in the last week? That's kind of an ambiguous question and could mean a few different things depending on, what's going on. So a good response isn't just a query that comes back. A good response is something that comes back and says, hey, I see a few different things here. Do you mean, new subscriptions that we've added that has this description that the analyst put in it? Do you mean churned subscriptions, people who we've lost, who have canceled the subscriptions? That means this with this definition. And you sort of ask that clarifying question, being able to give the context that the analyst has put into the definition of the metric. And if, as long as the analysts do a good job with that, with those descriptions, then the end users are able to say, oh, well, I was thinking, acquisition, like new subscriptions. So yeah, let's do that one. The really important step there is the disambiguation, that when you ask that kind of question that might be across two things, it's able to serve up all that context that the analysts thoughtfully wrote, not that an LLM just guessed at, that the analyst thoughtfully wrote, and that is what allows the business user to basically disambiguate it.
My second question is kind of around, I guess you call it QA. If the answer comes back, I think a lot of times the analyst could intuitively look at it and be like, you know what, this seems a little low. Like, let me double check the math or the query or what we're pulling, right? In the context of intuition for the data. Totally. Is that lost?
I think that's another crucial reason why the semantic layer is important. Because when the analyst is defining that semantic layer, then they're checking, hey, this definition is correct. If that definition is correct, unless something changes in the business, it will be correct forever unless there's a pipeline error. If there's a pipeline error, then the analyst really should be notified about that as soon as it happens, regardless of how the data is showing up in the tool.
Yeah, but I think you cover a really important part of data tool design in general, and this extends into semantic layers as well. Auditability, I guess, is super important, right? This manifests itself in many different ways, right? I mean, everything from the debate about should we have column level lineage at the transform layer, all the way up to the all too frequent question, hey, where did you get this number from the end user? It's like, oh yeah, are you sure this is accurate? It's funny because it's actually correct. It's important because a big part of business intelligence is telling people numbers that they don't want to hear, right? Yeah. So like maybe conversion rate is actually down, and when you're giving people bad news, their first impression is to not believe it. So that just makes transparency, auditability even more important, yes. Right? I think how that manifests in the semantic layer is twofold. It's feedback on the inputs and feedback on the outputs, right? So like the inputs are a series of metrics or whatever you're asking about. The outputs is a SQL statement. So, our approach, and this is especially true with LLMs, right, is you ask a structured question, we over communicate what's actually being visualized to like excruciating details. So you could actually remake the entire query with a screenshot of that LLM feedback, for instance. So over communicate that to the end user, builds trust, shows transparency. Secondly, you want to be able to audit the SQL generated by the semantic layer. And most tools that have semantic layers will do this, right? But in Zenlytic, for instance, you can expose the SQL that's being generated. If you are technical and you want to see what's being written, you could actually say, okay, show me the SQL. Take that, you could copy and paste that into your data warehouse query window, for instance, and get the same data back, and then massage and tweak it to your heart's content.
That makes sense. And, side note, and this is a whole other conversation in a different episode, but a lot of times the pipeline errors are discovered through the numbers being weird, right? You're like, oh, wait, this doesn't make sense. And then, because we didn't onboard last month's data.
Well, it's funny because if you're not spotting pipeline errors, that is probably just a sign that nobody's using it. Like these are complicated and there always are things to adjust, and there's ongoing edits. So
absolutely,
those are actually probably a good sign that people are scrutinizing the data.
It also speaks to the way that the data pipelines and the entire platform and infrastructure were built, that usually when it's fast and quick and to answer a certain thing and is not engineered in a way that monitors and alerts about issues, then that's what happens. That's how, in my experience, that's how we've discovered them. But that's because it wasn't built in a robust way. But then you never kind of have then it's a tech debt. You don't go back and fix it because you want new features.
This is like an engineering principle in general, but it's super true of data pipelines, is that it's always good to build something with the, build for the worst, hope for the best. So like build it with the assumption that something is going to break, right? And it's kind of like, have you ever seen those things on big rigs, like a flatbed truck where they have every lug nut has a little arrow on it that's kind of pointed in a non-gravitational direction? So, that's just a great example of like robust engineering, where you assume that at some point in time, one of those nuts is probably going to come loose. And then you just build in early warning signals to correct that easily at the source, right? And data engineering is inherently complicated, inherently messy. And building in visibility, at every stage in that is actually an important part of delivering on that trust and transparency to the end user.
So Zenlytic comes at a time when there's an explosion of data tools in the industry. Can you talk about the impact that this revolution in general has had to both individual lives as well as to businesses?
So we are definitely at a time where there is a huge kind of unbundling, if you will, of a bunch of different things that exist now as standalone tools. Like you wouldn't have even probably talked about data observability as a wholly separate tool before Monte Carlo and similar companies came along. And you've got a lot of other products like that. I would say one difference for us is that we're going after one of the sort of original market. There's a lot of companies out here making great products, adding new markets like new data catalogs, new data observability tools. We're going after one of the sort of older classic markets. And I would say the main way that we're going to impact people's day-to-day lives is that it's going to change what they're working on. They're doing a really good job defining these metrics, making sure that these definitions are correct, are what the business is thinking about when they're defining them, and then allowing the large language model to be able to surface those to the end users asking the questions. So I think that's really how the job changes and that's really exciting, by the way, is it's like you're spending less time at asking these ad hoc questions, more time doing the really sort of rewarding work of making sure the definitions are good and doing the advanced analytics work that no LLM is going to do, that you really need humans to be writing, complicated code for.
I would say generally there's been a lot of talk about bundling versus unbundling. And I think we've seen unbundling happen over the last several years in, the data industry. I actually think that generally when you have a bunch of growth and innovation, it sort of leads toward the unbundling phase. And then, when the economy turns south or whatever, that starts to head towards bundling, right? And tools consolidate at that point in time. And I think that we're probably starting to hit that elbow now, partially driven because it's been a less than stellar economy for the last few months. Partially, I think we're at that level of maturity in the cycle where people start to look towards bundling. So I think, I don't know a crystal ball, but if I were to guess, I would say we're going to start to see more of the bundling happening as we go forward. I think we're at that stage of the cycle.
I agree with you. I think just from having looked at, done sort of the survey of data tools for, specific purpose of data warehouse and visualization tool, there's just so much out there and it's so hard to figure out exactly what to use for what purpose and what connector they have, and et cetera. And I kind of liken it to just like the streaming wars where, there was like Netflix and Apple Plus and all that. And you've got so many streaming services now that you kind of, when you disconnected from cable, that it's too much. And I think there's going to be a little bit more of a bundling going on now. We've hit that elbow probably, because now you're paying for streaming services the same that you were paying for cable.
Yeah,
Totally.
that's right. After all, 7 of your streaming services, exactly.
Right.
And it's also just complexity too, right? Like I have to, if I'm watching a show now, I have to Google like where to stream first so I can figure out who has it on their
Oh my
streaming
God,
service.
yes.
That's like 10 times worse in the data world because like the number of interfaces scale as the squared relationship with the number of tools, basically, right? Or it's like an exponential relationship. So as we add more and more tools, we're just adding more and more edges to connect them with, and it gets messier and messier.
Yeah, and you have an added layer of optimization to that as well. You want them to work well and not slow each other down. That's a whole other headache.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, 100%. And you have to consider fragility, right? The more edges you have,
Yes.
The more places there is, like, stuff usually breaks at the boundaries, right? So like, and the more boundaries you have in your stack, the more fragile it becomes. But I think it's been driven by, there's been a huge amount of growth and demand for this. So that look at 2022 as a really roaring tech market, for instance. That leads to people getting optimistic and trying new things. And I think it's great. That's where innovation happens. What's the Warren Buffett quote, right? When the tide goes out, we'll find out who's been swimming without a bathing suit, or something like that. So, I think this is a natural cycle where, innovation, happens first when there's lots of opportunities and lots of booming. And then in that consolidation time is when you test what's really, really valuable and you sort of refine. And then there's going to be another heyday where more innovation happens and, it's and rinse, repeat, basically.
So we talked about this a little bit, but I want to kind of touch on it again. Zenlytic gives the power to the end user who's not necessarily a data analyst, but a business user. And therefore, my experience has always been that I question, does that end user know the right question to ask just because they don't necessarily have the familiarity with the data? In your mind, first of all, as we said, Zenlytic kind of solves that through the context layer. But do you think, are there any other consequences like that of letting people ask the questions directly of an LLM without any kind of, I don't want to say that it's without an analyst being present or being in the mix?
No, so I think that's a great question. And I think that actually speaks to where I think sort of like future of data and future of industry goes. And to reference this, I would look back at, big technology swings that have happened before, right? When computers first came about, you had typists. And those people would basically work the computer for the executive who would just kind of sit back and do the same thing that they used to do, which is ask the person to do something and they would go and do it. Computers got easier. And it's not like executives couldn't make a mistake with the computers, but the computers got better and better, easier to interface with, easier to understand, easier to know what's going on, better auditability so they can see, hey, okay, I know that I'm making this change. This is what I expect it to be. I think the same thing's going to happen with data. And we're just at the early innings right now. Whereas previously, for the history of data, you've basically had an analyst who you just kind of asked to do stuff. That person runs off, does some magic, comes back with the answer. I think the new world that we're entering is where people are actually able to come in and ask their own questions about that data. And for sure, there's going to be some mistakes made. That's definitely going to happen. But as it progresses, more and more people in the business will just view this as a normal thing that they can do. They can just go and ask these things. And they'll learn as they go, just as humans learned computer interfaces, that this is just something you do. This is just, you just kind of figure out how to do this on the job. And that's just how things work going forward.
Yeah, I think, and Paul, one thing Paul really mentioned that I think is the most important thing there is sort of tighter feedback loops. In the case of Paul's typist example, I think that's what actually the computer did better than anything else, right? So like when in the typewriter era, if you were typing your own letter and you put a character down wrong, that is a 20-minute mistake, right? You throw out the page and you start typing all over again. And when you're an executive and you're not a professional typist, for instance, and you make that mistake, that's a big mistake. Fast forward to word processors, and if you type something wrong, it's a half a second mistake, right? So like it's just go back and correct it faster, basically. And LLMs unlock that in a lot of different ways for a lot of different industries. So I think there's going to be a lot of really cool opportunities, beyond just data for that. What that means for us is that tight feedback loop and articulating, the right question. You'd be amazed. We've looked over the shoulders of some of our users before, and people will ask absolutely torturous questions. Sometimes just single word. Just like Facebook. Tell me about Facebook, and it's like, okay, like, what do you want to know? The ROAS in your Facebook? You don't know about your Facebook campaigns? Like, tell me more. But so like they start off with a question that wouldn't work as a data question, But because the LLM can deliver that tight feedback loop, it's no longer a 4-day turnaround to a data team. It's instant. Okay, well, like, let's talk about Facebook. Like, are you thinking about your advertising effectiveness or what? Like, tell me more. The LLM will actually guide that user into the proper question that gets them to the output that they wanted.
So what is in the future for Zenlytic and for self-serve BI tool? What are you guys excited about next that you're working on?
So some of the really exciting things that we have in the pipe are, one of those is the ability to create whole dashboards. So right now you ask questions, you can get answers back that clarify, you get like single sort of plots back. The next big thing we have is for you, and this is really a tool for analysts at this point, to be able to say, hey, I want a dashboard with net revenue conversion, acquired users, ROAS by campaign, have all of this month to date, and then have, top line revenue metrics comparing this month to date to last year's month to date. And you just basically write just like an email to an intern that you want to create this dashboard for you. They go, and then in seconds comes back with a fully created dashboard for you with all this stuff. And instead of you having to go in and figure out everything, you can just effectively ask your intern to do it. They'll go create it for you. You tweak what needs to be tweaked, and you've got the end product. I think the thing that's exciting for analysts then is if someone asks for an executive asks for a new dashboard that's going to be, a long running report viewed by the company, instead of having to spend a few hours going in and individually grabbing everything, spend a few seconds and then tweak it a little bit, make sure everything's what you expect, and send it over.
We're kind of a funny place. We're in a great place right now because there's so many neat directions you can take this technology. Actually, it's a rare opportunity. Even in tech businesses, a lot of the times you focus on one great idea and you refine it and you optimize it for a while after that. But we have just such a just like anyone else who's using this technology, there's just such an open road ahead of us. I would say, generally speaking, one thing that might excite me the most is increasing capabilities of what a data chatbot can do. I think a lot of the time that kind of goes from descriptive to prescriptive to proactive. To illustrate that with an example, like right now, you can go in and ask all sorts of stuff about what your churn was and what was driving your churn, and get to an answer from that. But there's a time not too long from now when you can log into Zoe the chatbot, and they'll say, oh, hey, welcome back. I saw last week you were asking a bunch of questions about churn. You should know that in the last 48 hours, your churn has increased by 7%. Like, do you want to start looking into that? And, someone that could actually start sifting through the massive and growing amount of data that we have to find those needles in the haystacks automatically. That gets me really excited.
Yeah, that really, really sounds exciting.
I'd say just generally speaking, there's so much room for all of this LLM tech, and we've had a seismic shift in the capabilities of computing. And these are the times when all sorts of amazing new use cases get unlocked, and more than just data. I just feel like that we are at the start of what will be the mother of all Cambrian explosions in how you interact with computers, right? And in the application layer of LLMs, I think, is going to be very exciting place over the next 6 to 12 months. We're going to see people who are building proper startups that harness this technology. And like, to give you one small example, I just helped my wife put together a presentation for her work, and she's like, Ron, I have to give this presentation in Japanese, and I don't speak Japanese, but I hopped on ChatGPT. I gave it a couple of sources. I said, okay, give me a PowerPoint with this, and I did some prompt engineering to specify title, text, whatever. It gave me a good draft. I iterated a bit, asked it to do it in Japanese. It does that. At that point, I can't read it, but I'm trusting it.
Right.
And then I used a little known trick actually to turn that into a proper PowerPoint. It was a text document now and sitting in ChatGPT, but you could actually ask it to write the VBA script to turn this into a PowerPoint. So I did that, pasted in a PowerPoint, click run, it turns into slides, a couple of clicks on the design, pick a color palette. And the end result was, a very good amount of the way there for a functional presentation. And it took me, 5 minutes. And my wife was just blown away. She's like, how'd you do this so fast in a language that you don't speak? And the interesting thing about that is that it was super powerful, but it still took a little bit of expert knowledge, right? Like, I know a thing or two about prompt engineering. I knew that VBA trick, right? And those are just those little friction points that keep it quite from going mainstream. I don't think that many people are building proper PowerPoints with ChatGPT yet because of those little points. I know there's a bunch of startups who are doing this now that are actually just taking those points out, turning them into a visual interface, for instance, that automatically pastes in the VBA. And that's going to become a super powerful tool for accelerating, the generation of a PowerPoint. And I think there's just thousands of opportunities like that. Pretty much every application layer piece of software can benefit from new use cases like that. And I think we're going to see a huge amount of growth in that. Like I said, next 6 to 12 months is when they're going to start emerging.
Yeah, and that really speaks to the changing skills in our industry, that it really is going to be about prompt engineering and understanding how to work with the technologies. Like when I get asked, ChatGPT going to put us out of a job? It's like, no, but we will be replaced with people who know how to use it.
Mm-hmm. AI won't take your job, but someone who's good at using AI will. Yeah,
exactly.
100%.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. This has been really, really interesting conversations. Very fascinating. Sounds like you have a really great tool technology and vision. And so I want to thank you for coming on and talking about it and explaining to us a little bit more about business intelligence and generative AI.
Great. Thanks so much for having us. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Pleasure to chat.
If people want to find out more about you or follow you, where can they find you?
You can check us out at zenlytic.com. And we also offer a free 30-day trial. So if you want to just hop in there, see what it's all about, and test this out on your own data, feel free to hop in there. Free 30-day trial. Don't have to put in a credit card or talk to a salesperson or anything.
And if you want to connect Paul and I personally, we're both active on LinkedIn and Twitter. It's like Ryan Janssen and Paul BLankley. Look for the nerdy ones and you'll probably find us.
Well, thanks for joining us today and listening to this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And if you have any questions you'd like addressed, send them to who'syourdatanow@gmail.com. That's who'syourdatanow, all one word, @gmail.com. Thanks, and see you next time on Who's Your Data?